Faith, Family, and Adventure. I'm Steve Hunt, and we have our panelists today for our open faith discussion. Today, we're talking about objective morality, whether or not there is such a thing, and whether that can be found in religion, in atheism, or whatever. And so I'm going to invite Daniel to introduce us to the topic, and go ahead.
Yeah, so in our back channel, we talked, the idea of morality came up a little bit. And so I decided to go back and watch some debates between atheists and theists, and one that deal with the subject of morality in particular. And there's a common argument that gets made for the existence of God. It's the argument for morality, which basically says if objective moral standards exist, then a moral lawgiver exists. Objective morality does exist, therefore God exists, or a moral lawgiver exists, and we call that moral lawgiver God. So I was watching this debate, and Frank Turek is a Christian apologist who likes this particular argument a lot. And I was like trying not to scream at my phone watching this debate, wishing that I could be on stage with him, because he didn't seem to get it. And so the premise, of course, that I would disagree with is this idea that objective moral standards exist. Ought statements, anything that requires like a value judgment on the part of a subject can't be objective. So that's the premise I'm disagreeing with. For morality to be objective, it would mean it's like a law of the universe, per se. So is statements about the nature of reality can be objective. A human can disagree with it, but they would be wrong. Something like morality might be universal. For example, murder is wrong, virtually universally held. And maybe you could find a few exceptions, but the vast majority of people would say it's wrong. So it's pretty much universal, but universal doesn't mean it's objective. It still requires humans, subjects, to make a value judgment about it.
And just to give, kind of some credit where it's due, is this something that you had also previously developed and thought of and argued before watching CosmicSkeptic, or is this we're a little bit responding to CosmicSkeptic's videos on objective morality, am I right?
Yeah, so CosmicSkeptic, I think, probably influenced my thinking on it. I think probably what CosmicSkeptic brought to it that I hadn't really considered is his argument is even if there's a God, it still wouldn't be objective. So even if somehow we could establish that objective, like that objectively God does exist and we know it for certain, and he has a moral code, it's still his moral code. It's still his subjective view, and we're free to follow it or not follow it. So, and even if his moral code pretty much aligned with ours and was universally agreed upon, it would still be rooted and grounded in our acceptance of it, not based in the nature of reality, if that makes sense. So that's what CosmicSkeptic, I think, adds. Even if God exists, it's still not objective.
And he defines morality as that there is a statement that there is good and evil or not good. And then secondly, that we ought to do that which is good. And then he, just to summarize, says that, first of all, it seems that when we say there is good or there is not good, that everybody may have their own opinions about what is good and not good. And so, but if we could come up with a law for what is good and what is not good, what you're saying here is that would either come from the people who made up that law, and therefore it's their own subjective opinion, or it might come from God and it's his subjective opinion. But then furthermore, just because we've established that there may in fact be good, that everyone here's the next question, that should everyone agree that it is good, or should everyone, even if we grant that is what equals good, some mathematical or scriptural equation, this is good, then does that necessarily mean we ought to pursue the good, right?
Yeah. And so this makes me think of David Hume. The philosopher David Hume has what he calls the is-ought problem. You can never derive an ought from an is, logically. So So even if you have 100 is statements, you always have to introduce an ought statement. You can't derive it logically from any number of is statements. So you can say like murder is harmful. Murder harms people. That's an is statement. Therefore, we ought not murder. That's an ought statement, and it's not logically valid. So it doesn't follow that because murder is wrong that we shouldn't do it.
But it does if you're given one more premise in that syllogism, right?
But it's going to be an ought, but it's going to be an ought, not an is.
Well, if you say
we should avoid that which causes harm, it's another ought statement.
If you say murder ends life, life is preferable, I guess we ought to do what's preferable to get to we ought not murder.
Yeah, there's always an unstated, it might be unstated, and that's where the tricky part is. We kind of take it for granted. It's so obvious. Of course, we prefer what's preferable. But it is technically still an ought statement to say we ought to prefer what's preferable. It is an ought. And so you have to introduce an ought somewhere. It can't logically follow from any number of is statements. So that's the is ought problem.
Well, I don't know if we have to say we ought to prefer what is preferable, but we ought to do or not do what is preferable or not preferable.
Yeah, we should act in accordance with our premises. Yeah.
We ought to do what we ought to do. That's a tautology.
Yeah, it also doesn't help. So yeah, if we have, does anybody in the group have a response, the more visceral the better, to this idea that morality,
it makes me so angry.
that morality is entirely subjective and that there is no objective morality.
I want to prophesy in advance that somebody's going to mention the Holocaust in this discussion. Besides me, I just did. So somebody else.
It won't be me.
You don't get it. We've talked about this in my family. You don't get to win a bet that you make and then you go ahead and fulfill it yourself.
Right.
I
will use the Rwandan genocide instead.
Wakandan. No, okay. So we have, does anybody in the group right now feel that morality is in fact objective? Let's get some hands here. Who, there we go. Okay. We have Joey siding on that side. We have a Jacob somewhat. And then how many absolutely believe that morality is subjective?
Depends on how you define that, but I would say
Daniel. Okay, and so then the rest of us here, we have Corey and Dave and I, kind of on a convince us either way. Is that where we're at? All right, Joey, do you want to speak first?
Well, I do want to respond to one thing that Daniel said, and that is that even if God does have a moral standard, that his is just subjective also. And the retort that I would make to that is that God is not just another one of us. He's not just another bystander. He's not, because, well, in certain versions of Latter-day Saint doctrine, and you guys please correct me if I'm wrong, I probably am wrong. In certain versions of Latter-day Saint doctrine, God is just another intelligence like us. He may have progressed to a state that's far above where we are now, but it's a state that we can progress to. And there were others before him that progressed to this state before he did. And presumably there was a time before he had progressed to that state where he was just like us. I know that that's only one version of Latter-day Saint doctrine and worldview. Other versions would put God in more of an absolute, he's the only God kind of position. And then there may be a range of other across the spectrum ideas, but the version of God that I believe in is the absolute ground of all that exists. Nothing would exist if not for him. He owns all of this stuff. Everything that exists by his good pleasure. And so if he wants to impose an objective moral standard, he has a right to do so. And so his moral standard is not just another subjective opinion in a sea of opinions. His opinion is the opinion because he owns all this stuff. So I'm not sure there's much else that I wanted to respond to directly in what Daniel said.
I could piggyback a little bit off to like give at least a Mormon version of what you're saying there. Is that at least, because you're right, there's a lot of versions of how that plays out in Mormonism, but at least in Mormonism, God has he has a view of the universe that's high enough that he basically can see how everything can potentially play out in one way or another. So he has enough knowledge that he can see what we can never see, which is, I think, a philosophical phrase, which is called all things considered. That's something humans can never take into account because we can never consider all the things because we don't know all the factors. But even in an LDS view, I think God has the view of all of the factors and the variables, maybe not exactly how they will play out, but he knows the outcome. If this happens, then, and this outcome happens, I don't know, like maybe I'm muddying it a bit for myself, but the view is high enough that you can see what the outcome will be, and therefore you can determine if it was good or bad. But we'll have to do this too, but you have to define what your goal is ultimately, and if it's aligned with whatever God's ultimate goal is, or if it's good for us and so forth. We'll have to discuss those things.
Is that enough then? Let's just grant those positions for a second, one at a time perhaps. But if we go ahead and just grant that God is the source of the entire universe, created it all ex nihilo, is his opinion is the ultimate opinion, and so forth, as Joey said, does that change it to be other than an opinion? It is the way things are. Because he made things the way they are, if we grant that, then things are the way they are based on his opinion. Does that then make what is right, right? And does that then also now create an ought, that we ought to do what God says is right because he told us to, and if we don't, he'll punish us or whatever? Does that create the ought? Joey, do you want to answer that first and then have Daniel maybe rebut it? Is there an ought with that, Joey? Just if God created it all, do we now ought we to do what he commands?
Well, yes. I think that's about the only ground that you could possibly come up with for real ought statements is there has to be someone with the authority to make ought statements. I agree with Daniel. Like, you can never go from a bunch of ises to an ought. And that is exactly where I would turn around on Corey and say, okay, fine. Even if we grant God is omniscient and he knows all the is statements that anyone can ever possibly know, he still can't go from that to an ought statement unless he is God in the classical sense of being the absolute ground of all that exists. If he's operating in the same space that we are, right, and that there are principles that are higher than him that we share in this shared space that we co-inhabit, then he doesn't have the authority to make ought statements. So,
all right, Daniel, you want to respond to this idea that if God created it all and he laid down the groundwork and the rules, he can say ought? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, did he? I guess I would answer by asking a question of Joey. Like, is God behind the laws of logic? So, for example, if could God make a four-sided triangle?
No.
So the laws of logic aren't contingent on God's existence. Those are just facts about the nature of reality independent of God. And that's the same with the is-ought problem. It's a law of logic that you can't get an ought from an is.
Let Joey respond a little deeper. I think he'll have to. Is that God set the rule for what a triangle was?
That's just, I've never liked that one. There's so many better logical paradoxes than that one. That's just the definition of a triangle. The definition of a triangle came from the human mind.
Okay.
Well, the definition of everything technically did. So.
Well, there you go.
And it's the same as 3 + 3 = 7.
Can God
Right? Can God make 3 + 3 = 7?
Yeah, these are
Could
just
God make
these are
a burrito
just sounds.
so hot that he couldn't eat it?
What's that?
Could God make a burrito so hot that he couldn't eat it?
See, that is much better. I'm serious. That's much better.
I would say that logic is grounded in the being of God. it's not something that's above or behind God.
Did you
It's
say the
grounded in his
bean?
being. The bean, yes. Well, beans and cheese.
Right.
And
Okay.
I assume there's some kind of green sauce or red sauce in there, wrapped up.
Oh, this is where holy moly comes from. I get it.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
Dad joke overload.
So
Yeah, I would want to, and I mean, I think this is the only position I can take. I would want to deny that there is any principle or rule or law that is above or behind or outside of God. God, which I guess raises the question: could God choose to make the laws of logic differently than they are? But I would say that they're wrapped up in his own being, and he's a necessary being. I don't think he could choose to cease to exist, for instance. I don't think he could choose to be different than how he is. And I don't think he wants to choose to be different than how he is. I don't think God feels stuck, the way that he is. So it's an interesting question. But yeah, I would not say that God is beholden to the laws of logic the way we are. I would not say that the laws of logic exist behind or above him and that he has to follow them. They just are who he is.
I mean, if he can't violate them, isn't that what it means to be beholden to a law? I mean, if they're impossible to violate, he literally cannot do it. It would seem to me that means they exist.
Yeah.
They exist outside of him. They're not contingent on his existence. Even if he didn't exist at all, it would, the laws of logic would
unless
still
we're
hold true.
equating the two, right? Unless we're saying God is the laws of logic, God is the laws of the universe, God is the universe and all of its laws wrapped up. And if you equate them, then one can't exist without the other because they're the same thing.
But then you go into pantheism, and that's not the same thing as classical theism. So yeah.
Right. But I would do that. I would equate God with the laws of logic. I think that logic just is the mind of God. I don't think that leads to pantheism, though. I would deny that. But I would say neither that the laws of logic are above or behind God, and that he somehow. But I would also deny that he invented the laws of logic, that they're somehow like a creation of his. I think they just are his mind. They're his thoughts.
Okay, let's run with that for just a second then. In as much as Joey's kind of explained that God is, or the laws of logic are bound up in God, God is bound up in the laws of love, they are the same in that way, equated. And so he then also is the source of all things. I'm going to toss it back to Daniel. Can he then state an ought statement because he's the source of those things? And can we get to an objective ought statement from that kind of a God? And what, if not, why not?
Haven't we skipped a step here, though? I mean, what? So I'm sorry, Daniel. I didn't mean to interrupt, but
no, it's fine.
Why don't we take the question at face value of whether there can be moral absolutes or objective morality without God before we say, okay, now what about with God? I mean, you're making Daniel argue. He disagrees with the premise, doesn't he? Why don't we start with, look, it appears that there are moral consistencies around the globe in every culture. What accounts for that? And
it's historically religionists who claim there's moral absolutes, and historically atheists don't. Sam Harris changed the game a little bit by saying we can derive moral absolutes even in atheism, and then we have the Cosmic Skeptic responding saying, actually, Sam, you're wrong, and it is subjective. But then the Cosmic Skeptic is saying there's nothing wrong with that, though, because even religionists have subjective. So that's where I've come to is I'm asking Daniel to defend the Cosmic Skeptic, who says that actually all morality, including religious morality, is subjective. And Joey is saying he thinks that can be objective with this kind of God. So that's where I'm at. But
I can respond to it as stated. Like, if God exists, so if we just grant that God does exist, and that he has his moral code, I mean, I feel like I stated this kind of too at the beginning. If he says you ought to do this particular thing, the question is, ought we do what God says? You know, and it seems to me that you can't say that that it's a fact of the universe that we ought to do what he says. Some may, some might not. I would still base my morality on my standard, not God's. You know, if God told me to do something that I felt was immoral, as I understand morality, if he told me to do something that I thought would cause harm, I would say, unless you can convince me that this actually doesn't cause harm, or it causes more good in the long run than harm, then I'm not going to do it.
Do you stick with that, Daniel, even if you accept the classical definition of God as omnibenevolent? See, because it seems to me that you're right. If there's some being that is infinitely more powerful and wise than I, and I'm an ant, and this is a human being, a physicist or something, if that's the difference, and I know that the difference between humans and God is infinitely more so in Joey's theology, but just because there's a being, a little boy with a magnifying glass up there, that is scooting me along to where that magnifying glass is touching the ground, doesn't mean I should obey him just because he's so much more advanced and powerful than me, because the being's not omnibenevolent. He wants to hurt me, right? So just because if there's aliens that come down and they're so far advanced technologically, that doesn't mean, oh, they're so far beyond us, so we should do what they say, except in the sense of to avoid them killing us, right? But not in a moral sense. So that's my question for Joey is, if somebody's just, way more powerful than us, why does that mean we should in a moral sense obey them? And part two is to Daniel, if that being is omnibenevolent and we accept that as a given premise of the argument, why shouldn't we obey them?
So, I'll start by saying I wouldn't take it as a given. It would have to be demonstrated that he is omnibenevolent.
But you said I'll accept the premise that God exists, and I thought you meant the God Joey worships.
No, I separate them out. So if God exists, it's still a separate question as to whether he's good. So
but that's one of his fundamental characteristics. So if God exists, what do you mean about God existing if you don't mean a being that's omnibenevolent and omnipowerful?
Just a being that created the universe.
So you just mean a creator.
Maybe even out of
He's saying
nothing.
that you can't derive the personality of God just because he would be a God.
Yeah, if you could establish he exists, you still have to establish his characteristics separately.
I thought you were arguing with Joey's position by granting his premise that God exists, and the God that I know Joey is talking about is an omnibenevolent being.
He
or
believes
all benevolent.
Well,
I'm not sure if I'm using it right. Is that not right, Joey? Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth.
No, you're right. Omnibenevolent.
Joey also believes that the Bible's inerrant, and the Bible talks about God commanding genocide. So, I mean, I would just flat out disagree with that assessment that he's omnibenevolent if we take the Old Testament as literally true.
Well, once again,
you definitely have to define what you define as benevolent. Yes.
Yeah, you're putting your morality over. I mean, Joey is putting God's morality is the ultimate moral authority. Excuse me. And so if you were to say, but I'm going to judge God's actions, then you're not accepting the premise, which is fine, because as I said in the beginning, I don't think it's fair to make you accept the premise and then argue the conclusion. Yeah. But if you're purporting to accept the premise, then I think you have to accept it all the way, which is, this being is by definition omnibenevolent. So why should you second guess his moral commands?
If there was some way of knowing for certain that God exists and God is omniscient and God is all good and he tells me to do something, I'd have to think about that. I mean, first of all, it's obviously hypothetical. I don't see any way that I could know any of those things for sure. But
that's just how I understood the question.
Yeah. If he told me, then let's just grant all that and say, okay, he's all good and he tells me to do something, so I do it. I still don't think it would still be a violation of the laws of logic
Well, see, this is where in the back channel, what I heard Stephen saying in response to your argument was, I'm with you all the way until God himself tells me to do something, because if God tells me to do it and it's completely, that is my inescapable conclusion that God has told me to do it, then I would assume that because he's omnibenevolent, because he's infinitely more wise than I, that this is and he tells me it's moral, that this is the moral action. Now, I'm with you, Daniel, in the sense that if I believe God has told me to, say, harm my children, as some people with mental illness believe God has told them to do, and also some characters in the Bible believe God told them to do, then I would say there's a number of links in this chain that might be weak. One of them is my own mental health. I'm going to assume it's that one rather than assuming that it's God telling me to, injure my children, and that therefore God's morality is screwed up or something. It's easier for me to say, I'm probably crazy right now and I should check myself in somewhere. I don't know if that's even on topic. Sorry, go back to what you were saying.
Well, if I can jump in for just a second, I think that if we grant the premise as has been presented that God is omnibenevolent, just all good, just for those who may not be all familiar with the words, and all powerful and all knowing, and the classical God like that, and he created everything. And then he does appear and says, this is what I've done and created, and this is what is good, and this is what you ought to do. And he says that. What's funny about that is, even though God has said to me, you ought to do this now, there is still the question of, ought I to do what he says I ought to do? Like, just because he actually says you ought to doesn't mean I ought to, even if he's all of those things. It seems like most of us would say, well, of course. And this is where on the back channel I said that. I said, well, if he did appear, and if there were a way that I knew this is God and it's indisputable and he's right here and he's telling me you ought to do this, then I said on the back channel, then I would do it. And the reason I would do it is because of all those things that we've given. And yet, I think that's a subjective decision on my part, at least. Now, this is an interesting thing, because we've talked about our ability to choose, our agency, or whatever, because he is allowing me to choose whether or not I want to do what he's just said I ought to do. I have still that personal decision of asking, well, ought I to do that? And that is subjective.
But it seems to me that, God telling you ought to do X, and then you saying, but ought I to do X, is equivocating on the definition of ought, or at least you're using it in two separate senses. In the first instance, God's saying you ought to do it, and you hear that as, you're telling me I should do this, but I still have a separate individual inquiry of whether I should do this. So my question is, what does your second separate inquiry consist of?
My inquiry is,
what is your value?
The value is, ought I to follow? Am I under some obligation? Ought I to do what the omnibenevolent and omnipotent and omniscient being has said I ought to do? Like, because he has said that, does that now mean?
Yeah, I know. I think we're asking the same question, but what I'm asking you to do is to explain to me your decision-making criteria for that second question. You said, in the first instance, God says you ought to do X, and then you say, but ought I to do X? That's the second question. So what I'm saying is, we're assuming, putting our prior discussion about free will and determinism aside, we're assuming that you do have a choice here. Otherwise, this is all meaningless, right? To a certain extent, with apologies to Daniel and Joey, I guess, if that misrepresents your position on free will and determinism. But we're assuming that if God says you ought to do this, that he's giving you the ability both to do it, but also, and maybe this is where Joey would disagree with me, you have the ability not to do it. Otherwise, why would he bother telling you what you ought, right? But question number 2 is, just because he said that, is that the end of the inquiry, or do you still have a separate independent inquiry about what you ought to do? And if you do, my question is, what is guiding that inquiry? What are you basing that decision
on? Just to go just a really short answer, I guess I would say this. Is it a given that everyone in the entire universe would agree? I mean, there's 2 parts to this, that if such a being existed and appeared and unequivocally gave that kind of an ought command, is it a given that everyone in the universe would necessarily agree, okay, sounds like you ought to do it? Or are there some who disagree? And the funny thing is, though, that as the Cosmic Skeptic points out, even if everyone in the entire universe did agree, does that mean it is the rule? It is the ought. You know?
Yeah, universal is not the same as objective. So even if every single person agreed on something, that doesn't make it objective. And this question of like if God was benevolent and all that, like the question of whether I would go along with it is still separate from whether or not it's an objective moral statement. So like maybe I might go along with it, but that still doesn't mean it's objective. I might agree with it. Think about it, what it would mean for God to be the grounding of morality. That would mean, hypothetically, and I grant this is hypothetical, but that would mean if God said murder is okay, then it would be okay by definition, because God is the grounding.
And now, if he changed his mind tomorrow, that would also be the grounding.
Yeah. And it would make morality completely arbitrary. It's whatever God says. And we recognize that that's not true. Like nobody can make murder good. It's bad because it hurts people. Like that's, let me back up because I want to make sure I'm saying this clearly. My view on morality is it can be objective with respect to an ultimately subjective goal. So if your goal is well-being of conscious creatures, that standard is ultimately subjective, but you can talk objectively with respect to that subjective goal. So with respect to that goal of furthering well-being of conscious creatures, murder is objectively wrong, but it's not ultimately objective because that standard is subjective. So if God is the grounding, then morality is just arbitrary, as far as I can tell, even if it's just hypothetically speaking. Now perhaps you're thinking, well, okay, but God would never say murder is okay. I mean, I don't want to talk about Bible inerrancy right now. I think if you're believing Bible inerrancy, you kind of have to grant that he allows murder at certain times. But even if you say like God wouldn't do that, the question then is why? Because he wouldn't do a wrong thing. That means that the wrongness of an action isn't contingent on God. If it was grounded in God, then it wouldn't be wrong for God to condone murder.
You said if you hitch your moral wagon to God, then your morality is arbitrary. I think I would disagree with that. It's only arbitrary to the extent that you believe God's morality is arbitrary. But yes, you're right. It's certainly up to him, I think. And in that sense, it might be. I don't know what's a better word. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not saying it would be arbitrary to hitch your wagon to what God says. It may, like, let's say God exists, and maybe his views on morality perfectly coincide with my own. So I would have no problem hitching myself to it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if God is the grounding of morality, not if he's just a messenger perfectly in line with my understanding of morality. That's different. I'm talking about if he was the grounding of morality. If things became moral because he said so, then it would be arbitrary.
Right. This is what I'm saying. What we haven't articulated. And this is like a very famous thing called Euthyphro's dilemma, which it's the question of, is something good because God said it, or did God say it because it was good? And I think, you guys take it where you want, but at some point I want to interject with, I think at least in Mormonism, we come up more, well, at least from my view, morality doesn't have any meaning or rise whatsoever free of intelligent relationship or relationship able beings. And so without any relationships, there cannot be morality, obvious. And also, as Dave was getting at, without free will, there can't be morality because there can't be any oughts, because you have to have an alternative to do something otherwise morality means nothing. And so it's kind of actually close to what Daniel was just articulating, was saying, yes, I think if you say, let's just say there's a given that there is existence, which is kind of what Mormonism posits, right? So intelligences are, that's a given. God is, and he is higher than us. I don't know if that's a given or that developed, there's a lot of debate there, but it's still subjective. But it's saying kind of what he said, like we all kind of get together and we all agree, like, well, let's say we all want our well-being and to, we call it self-actualization on earth. We all want the well-being and the relationship that I don't know, I'm trying to articulate a couple of points. Like in my dad's book, he comes up with something called the Agape Theory, right? Which is, it has a lot of holes in it, from my view. But it's not supposed to be like a what do I do in every single case, but it's supposed to be kind of a meta ethic, which says it's based on the New Testament. It's like, well, let's assume that Christ was right when he said the laws that matter are basically love God, love your neighbor. And the reason that is we can say, well, let's say we want the objective well-being of all people. That's what divine love should be, overall well-being. But to know what the overall well-being is, that's something subjective. So we had to agree on what it is that we wanted. And if we said, hey, God, we want to be like you. It's like, okay, well, everything on earth is going to be, everything that we're doing here is going to that purpose. And so if you trust me to do that, then we can do that. And so on earth, I think where maybe the do everything God says could come in from that perspective, is being like, well, I trust that God has my best interests in mind. Therefore, if I do what he says, it will lead to maybe not even my short-term well-being, but the overall well-being of the ultimate goal that I see as God's plan. But it's not the same thing, because I think Mormons have to take the side of the Euthyphro's dilemma of something is good because, or God said something because it was good, but where that good comes from is ultimately not necessarily, well, I guess it's subjective, but it's also has to be agreed upon by people that can have relationships and think. I don't know, I'm kind of rambling now, but there you go.
No, I'll jump in because I think this there's groundwork for this in Mormonism. It kind of sidesteps, hey, do we have to follow something completely objective, or is it all subjective? I think it gets to the type of morality that Daniel has elucidated, and that the CosmicSkeptic has said. It was like, is if everyone comes into agreement that subjectively this is what we want, you can treat it as if it's objective, in which we in LDS thought, we say, hey, before this world was, right, there was this council, and everyone that's here seems to have subjectively agreed that we want to become more like God, and ultimately we'll get what we want. And then we have in the Book of Mormon, right, another thing that the Cosmic Skeptic brings up is like, you can't really define good, and you can't define not good, or in this case it would be evil, right, because it's too arbitrary. But when we have this kind of we can work towards this objective standard because subjectively we've all agreed on it. In Moroni 7, this is where it talks about, okay, so what is good and evil with this goal that we've all stated in mind, that we want to become more like God, right? And it says, well, those things, all things which are good cometh of God, and that which is evil cometh of the devil, right? And it talks about how we have the Spirit of God given to every man, so they may know good from evil. And then it says, for everything that inviteth to do good and persuadeth to believe in Christ is sent by the power and the gift of Christ. Therefore you may know with a perfect knowledge that it is God. It is of God. But whatsoever thing persuadeth men to do evil and to believe not in Christ and to deny him and serve not God, then you may know with a perfect knowledge that it is of the devil, right, or evil. And so we can trust God in that, hey, we've all subjectively agreed that we want to become more like you, and you know how to be like you because obviously you are you. So objectively, whatever is going to lead us towards that, because we're all acting on this one, we can trust. Did that make any sense?
I think so. We've, I've been intrigued by a few of the points that have been shared recently here. Some of the ideas about how morality, I guess I want to question whether these premises are true that have been brought up, that morality can, first of all, only exist among conscious beings who have some kind of agency or choice to act. Is that those are those? And again, we've discussed what that might mean, but that's why I'm saying some kind of agency or choice. Is that correct? If they're, I mean, the Cosmic Skeptic pointed that out in one of his videos. He said that if your actions are unconscious, it's not. Oh, you know what? It wasn't related to either of those two videos that we watched. This is another video where the Cosmic Skeptic does a video on whether or not homosexuality is moral or not, which is something we've kind of debated here in the background. And he just says the question is not a moral question. It's an amoral question, because he says that homosexuality is something that people don't have a choice of. And if you don't have a choice, if it's an unconscious thing, then it's not even a question of morality at all. And he's talking about specifically, I think, the attraction or whatever. But I'm using that as an example. If we have no choice, if we're not conscious, it's an unconscious thing that we're doing, then it's not there. There's no morality involved. Can we agree on that? Is there anybody that disagrees?
Well, let me clarify one thing. So I'm saying, yes, for us to act morally requires that, but even if we think like it has to arise in relationships to something, because if God existed, let's say in like the classical theist before creation, I don't know, it gets difficult if there's a Jesus there or whatever. Let's say God is literally one, but if there's nothing to relate to, then there's nothing to do. I mean, there's no I ought to do this, because there's no ought to happen. But once you start having things to relate to, even if they're not intelligent beings, let's hypothetically say that humans didn't exist, but all the animals existed on the entire planet, and God was creating the universe how it is. So I think there can still be morality in a way, but it still requires some being to have understanding of what is going to happen in relation to this other thing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be between two hyper intelligent beings, but that arises and it brings it even more into focus. But even if it was God and this universe that wasn't conscious as humans are, I think there can still be morality in that. Well, you shouldn't cause the suffering of these things that can suffer. And why is that? Well, because that's less. I don't know. It depends on. I guess you'd still have to establish what I said. There still has to be a goal in mind, like why. What do these beings exist for? You have to establish that definition of like why is there anything at all? And so once you answer that, then you say, well, if there is a reason why there's something instead of nothing, then whatever that reason is the thing that we're moving towards. And if it's in classical theism, I think it's because whatever God makes up, that's what it is. Like if he got bored with us and wiped us out, that's all good. That's what God wants. But I think from the other side, in like I was describing before, in a Mormon morality, it's like, well, we want the overall well-being and we have this goal, therefore everything moving in the universe has to I don't know, I'm going nowhere, but all I was trying to say is, no, I don't think they all have to be intelligent, but it does require at least a relationship between one thing that has intelligence and something else. I don't know, maybe I'm getting muddy there.
Well, I also want to hop back in because I should have said something on what I was saying that I didn't. And I think this goes in, obviously, to be able to make these kind of choices and engage in relationships at the level that we can even choose to want to become like God, we have to be sentient, right, or have consciousness. But I think this is where we go from an is to an ought. If we can say, God is God, whatever that means, and we saw what God is and we said, hey, we want to become like that, God can say, okay, I am what I am. If you want to be like this, you ought to do this. And that's why we'll be following that, whether you believe, he's omnibenevolent or maximum benevolent, whatever it is. It seems like that's a premise that we start with in Mormonism.
Right? It requires the if you
exactly.
want to be, then you ought. And so this is, and that's the requirement then, I guess, is that the requirement to go from an is to an ought. This is the path to become a doctor. If you want to become a doctor, you ought to take this path. And that's back to the question of, okay, God appears to me and he says, I'm God, I created everything. I even created morality and everything. And here's what you ought to do. Then we can only move to absolutely, I ought to do that, with the intermediate if question of, if I want to do what God says, or if I believe God, if I believe I ought. I mean, there's always this middle if thing of,
Sure.
you know,
But so,
right? Or
so
if
God
you want to
says,
be like me, you ought to do this.
and so God says, if you want to be like me, you ought to do exactly what I say. And we say, okay. And he says, sacrifice your only son, sacrifice your child. And I can't tell if you all are saying that that's the end of the inquiry for you, or if you're still saying,
well, no, I mean, the only time that you take that to the ought then is you ask, you have to, just because he said that, if God appeared, Dave, and said to you, I'm God, I created all things, here I am, it's unequivocal, you've got God in front of you, and he says, sacrifice your son. Yeah, do you not still have an if and an ought? There's no direct connection that you ought to do it.
Yeah,
I'm not following you.
Do you trust God? That's the thing, is like, is God more? That's why I think this is another thing that goes against classical theism. But like, if God, for example, is as in classical theism, where he just is, and the things that he is doing is just what he does because that's his nature. It's not necessarily a choice. And again, it's not moral. God is basically amoral on that choice, because he, not immoral, but amoral, then he can't necessarily have morals because he just is what he is, and he can't have it any other way. Wherein is in a free God, where God potentially could choose to do something bad that's scary, but God has consistently proven over the eons of time that he is a trustworthy being. He is someone that you can put your trust in, and therefore when he asks you to do something like that, you can make a choice like, well, that seems really crazy, and this kind of goes against everything, but I trust you and I'll do it. And whether or not you should have done it, I don't know. I don't know if you ought to have done that, and if ought to have God have, played with Abraham in that way. I don't know. Is that story literal? That's the one, kind of one of the ones I'm like, well, I sure hope that was an allegory, because like that, if God just plays games with us like that, then I'm gonna have to.
You said that you're relying on God's should statement because he's proved himself trustworthy. I would, if I were a completely impartial observer here, I would make Daniel's argument that the text tends to indicate otherwise. And particularly if he were asking me to do something as clearly immoral as to kill my son, who was blameless, I would think that relying on a track record is insufficient. Now, perhaps, and precisely because that request obliterates the track record, right? If you are relying on a simple, view of, well, God is the moral standard, and so I can do this and it's not immoral, then fine. But if you're saying I'm going to do this the thinking man's way and I'm still going to arrive at kill my son, I disagree. That is an act purely of faith. And by the way, there have been so many throughout history, people who have done horrible things believing God has commanded them to, and very few examples, if any, and only if we accept the text as written and its own self-serving conclusion that it was good, very few examples of people committing atrocities which were justified in the name of God, if any. Most recently, of course, I don't know about most recently, but most recently in the American cultural memory is 9/11, right? I mean, there's no difference here. If you are willing to say, if God commands me to do something, I guess there's one difference in that Stephen has repeatedly said, if it's God and it's God, rather than it's coming from Osama bin Laden, who's hiding in a cave saying it's God or whatever. But whatever. If you believe that God is asking you to do something which is otherwise immoral, I don't know. I think you get yourself into a lot of trouble if you're willing to do that thing. If you're not going to separate the inquiry and say, I have to do my own thinking on this. Yeah. Jacob says he can see the hurt in my head. This is look, in the end, my view is this. I think that there is such a thing as right and wrong. I think that it requires a lot of thought in a lot of different cases. I think that we try to get a lot of things right, and sometimes we get them wrong. And I think that God saying that you should do something horrible, which is completely hypothetical here, doesn't make it right. That's what I think.
Probably true, but this plays into, this is why, the reason we're having this discussion, I mean, this could play into this too, but let's take one example is, you know, in LDS theology, we have this problem of polygamy. God told us to do that according to Joseph Smith, literally, eventually with the sword. Okay, and also it plays into the discussion that we're having at large, and this plays into our talk of homosexuality, right? So it's saying, well, let's just give it that in the Bible, someone wrote down that God said that homosexual sin is bad, and we won't go into exactly all the homosexual stuff now because that's part of that. But that's what I'm trying to say, why this discussion matters in the whole of things. But also, if we, because I get what you're saying, like, right, obviously I struggle, and everyone should struggle with it. Like, so this God that supposedly has my well-being in mind asked Abraham, one of his most trusted servants, to kill his own son. And even though it was a trick, and maybe it was it was a metaphor for my son later. And don't you see how hard, like, okay, but God, that's not right. And so what you're arguing is that if
or
we
even
can't trust God to do something that's in our well-being, then that's the problem. The problem is saying is that leads to a slippery slope of, well, then why do we don't trust God? Because at least in LES thought, how I see it is, the thing is, we said, God, we trust you. And when that's the only thing that religion serves anybody, is like, things are happening to me and they're bad, but I trust that if God has the power to take them away or give them, that I can either learn something from this or it serves some higher purpose or something else. And there's a lot, like, you know, I actually lean more towards process theology, so that is a different topic.
Sure, but if you
get rid of that, all I'm saying is, if you get rid of that, then you might as well never listen to God. Yeah, I don't know.
No. There's a big difference between my son has died of blood cancer and I turn to God because of it versus kill your son. There's a big difference. So, you know, we can trust God. It's like, goes back to this discussion about, you know, you wake up in the woods and you see no way out and there's people telling you to follow them. Who do you follow and why? And, you know, the answer that we arrived at is nobody goes it completely alone. You're always, probably not always, but you're sometimes following somebody, and you're sometimes walking in your own path. But the religion says, tie your hand to mine, right? And you're always going to follow this path. And that's dangerous because you don't know the intentions or the wisdom of the person whose hand you're tying yours to. If you receive a spiritual witness, as we've talked about, that this is the truth and the best way to go, and then you can say, okay, I'm comfortable tying my hand to this person, but ultimately, you know, you're still tying your hand to a person. Now, you might be saying, no, I'm getting vertical communication directly from God, personal revelation, but you're still, to a certain extent, following a person. Now, if even the vertical communication that you believe you're receiving personally from God says, kill your son, I think there has to still be, and maybe that was a metaphorical story, and maybe it wasn't literal, and maybe, but it's in there, right? If that is the command from God, and you simply defer on the moral question, and you say, well, you know, if God said it, then it must be moral. I just think that that's so dangerous.
So, and that's
it is dangerous.
that's where I was bringing it back to you to see if you were, agreeing with what I had said earlier with that hypothetical situation that God is in front of you and it's unequivocally, it's, you know
There's
it's
no
him.
such thing. That's the problem is I cannot accept. I'm trying not to fight your hypothetical, but I've got to admit the possibility that whatever I'm perceiving is not real. And so if that's the situation and it's a question of you always have to weigh your perception of reality against what's being asked of you.
What I'm hearing from you, though, is that you're agreeing with what I was saying, actually, that you would say, no, there's something wrong here.
Yeah. You're on mute.
Sorry.
What are you doing?
Sorry.
Was that an object lesson of some kind?
Wait.
How did you hear anything? What I'm saying, sorry about that, is that that you're agreeing because you, in that position, you would still have to ask yourself, ought I to follow this instruction? The second question you asked me earlier in this video, under what grounds am I proposing that second question? And you've given it, you've provided it. I mean,
no. I was asking, what is your decision-making framework for the second question? I wasn't asking why it's a legitimate question. I believe it's a legitimate question, but what I think the effect of the second question is that it obviates the first point. If you're ultimately going to ask yourself the second question anyway, why does it even matter that God showed up and told you what you ought to do?
And that's the point of this conversation, is that because the second question must happen, given if anybody can come up with an objective instance where we objectively know what is good, because God appears to us and says this is good, or because the entire universe has agreed this is good, or because the laws of the universe have written it in the stars and you look up and you say it is good. The point is that even though we have an objective instance, a hypothetical where we objectively know what is good, we still must ask the question, ought I to do what has been presented as objectively good? And there is no connection from knowing that, I mean, even if, like I say, it's written in the stars, you shall now you shove your son over this cliff while you're walking through the woods. And that's what it says. Clearly, you still pause and you say, ought I? Because there is no obvious conclusion that just because I know what God wants me to do, or just because I know what is right, I must do it.
You're saying, it seems to me, and this will be my last comment for a while. I've dominated here for a while, the conversation. I don't mean to, but this one is, it gets me involved.
In short, I'm saying it sounds subjective to me. That's the summary. I can't see an objective. I'm agreeing with the Cosmic Skeptic right now. That's the side I'm on. I
think I agree too. If what you're saying is that ultimately, if we are free, then we are moral agents. And if we are moral agents, then our moral responsibility and accountability remains with us, regardless of what being has told us to do X, Y, Z. I agree with that. So ultimately, we do have a second question. That's my position, which means I'm not so sure that the first question that we've been talking about, God telling you what you ought, even really matters in a moral sense, except that it gives us guidance, because ultimately you still have a second question.
But it's the two halves. Just really quickly, that's what the Cosmic Skeptic pointed out. He claims that morality is defined with these two questions. In fact, one is what is good, and the second is ought we to do what is good. Essentially, those are the two questions that make up a question of morality.
Well, I still haven't heard a decision-making framework for the second question, but Jake, you've been wanting to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to take the instance with Abraham, right? And I'm not going to elucidate my stance on it quite yet. I want to hear your response to it, right? So take the approach that Jesus made in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? If there be any way, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. Now put this in the framework of Abraham, right? This is getting to, hey, however vertical we fill this, are we saying that type of an approach is wrong? He's saying, I don't want to kill my son, right?
Yeah.
If there be any other way, let this cup pass before me. Nevertheless,
before you answer,
not my
Christopher
will.
Hitchens had a great answer to this. I won't quote it verbatim, but he's like, "Yeah, if God asked me to do that, I said, F you, God," and like it was this big heat moment in this great debate. And maybe you should say that. I don't know.
I'm curious as to
I-
your response, because this we have, purportedly the Savior saying this, like that's his reaction to ultimately like the biggest thing that was ever accomplished.
Yeah, is that the difference between Christopher Hitchens and Jesus Christ?
There you go.
Look, I think a simple no would do fine. I'm. How could you know what you would do in that situation unless you're in the situation? You can't,
Sure.
right? And as Stephen has said, we're hypothetically positing here that you are so overwhelmingly convinced that the revelation you're receiving here is directly from God. And I just can't even put myself into that headspace. So it's hard to know what I would do, but I cannot imagine a situation in which I would think that it would be moral to do that. And so
Well, let me
you're-
compound. Can I just jump in, because this is something I'm struggling with too. So because I agree with Dave there. Like I'm trying to be devil's advocate to you, but this is my struggle right now in my personal faith. I'm being open with you. Is I have that same position. Like I don't know if I can actually trust, those things to be, what they purport to be. And so I always second guess, like, is any spiritual experience I've ever had something
Sure.
that I can actually put my trust into? Or, it could be for me. I could be totally made up, but it has to be, this choice that I make to trust God or not. That's kind of how I see the dichotomy. And because otherwise I'm paralyzed in that, like, I can't, and I have no use for God at that point, because he's can't communicate to me clearly. I can never separate God from myself, and therefore anything he says that's moral, I have to be like, well, maybe I just made that up in my head, and maybe I just thought, homosexuality was icky, for example. Maybe I have these preconceived notions, and I heard this and I liked it, and so I went along with it. But maybe it's not actually objectively morally wrong. I don't know, and so I read in the Bible that someone interpreted that God said it was wrong then. I read a few hundred years later, Paul had the same opinion, probably influenced by that. I hear now my leaders in the LDS church telling me that, like, no, we think it's wrong. And even if God, they haven't said God came down and gave him a revelation, but I think they infer that the family proclamation is a revelation. And so if the family proclamation is a revelation, then do I trust that, or don't I? And that's where I'm at.
When we're asking these kinds of questions of how do I know, is there even such an experience possible where I can know that God is saying something, or that this truly came from God? Can I even trust what's in the Bible or in the Revelation? When we're asking those questions, that's this first question of how do I know what is good? And yeah, we have a problem right there, because it's very hard to know objectively what is good. But even if we could, this is the point of the Cosmic Skeptic. He's saying even if we could know, even because he's making the argument against Sam Harris. Remember that his videos were against the atheist Sam Harris, who says actually we can come up with an objective reality of what is good, and that is we can simply say if it harms someone, if it harms a conscious being, then it is bad, and so forth. So, but the point is that when we're asking questions of how do I know if God really said this? How do I know if it's really right or good? That's the first question. And it is clearly a very difficult one, as Corey just indicated with his questions about it. But then we have the second difficult question. Even if we could know, does that mean we ought to do what is good? And it seems like everyone would say, well, of course. If we could know, of course. But what his point is that just because everyone would say, yeah, of course we ought to if they knew what good was, then that doesn't make it objective, first of all. But also, we've given some examples here. We've tried to create a scenario where good is defined not as don't hurt other people, but as whatever God says. and then create a scenario where God shows up and objectively we all have to say, he has now pronounced that it is good for me to kill my child. And in that objective scenario, all of us are kind of like, oh, I don't know if I ought to do what is objectively good, and so.
Well, yeah, but you're getting, I think we can't help but be sloppy with our terms here. I didn't agree that it's objectively good. I just agreed that God said
but that's
we ought
because
to
you're
do it.
skipping the whole premise. You're breaking I'm saying you have to assume that, Dave, and you're not allowing yourself to assume it. So we can't.
No, that you're assuming that's the argument, assuming its own conclusion. Isn't the question whether or not what God says is good?
No, that's the first question. I'm assuming
no.
we resolved that one.
No. My understanding of the question is whether or not God saying something is what we ought makes it moral, and by moral, I guess I thought we meant good. So if
I'm saying assume that that question that you've just asked, I'm ignoring it, and I'm saying let's assume the answer is yes. That's not the question we're trying to answer. Yes, we have that question, but that's the first question, and I'm just saying grant that yes, whatever God says is moral, grant it, and then we still have the second question.
I think we might be saying the same thing in different words, but I still disagree with your formulation there. But at any rate, I think that this exercise has convinced me that ultimately I believe I need to go through my own inquiry of what is good or right and wrong or moral and immoral, however, whatever word you want to use that I do not accept anybody's pronouncement at face value, including in this hypothetical, God's. But part of the reason why I'm having such trouble is because I would also have to question my own perception of whether or not God is telling me that. And I cannot take that out of the equation. I've tried, as we've been talking, but I cannot take it out of the equation. I can't isolate the variable, so to speak, because there's always the variable of my own perception of reality. And because of that, if I were in that situation, if I were Abraham, I would have assumed I was nuts. I would not have accepted that. Well, I don't know what I would have accepted because I can't put myself in that headspace, but I believe I would not have accepted. And given my own experience in life and seeing people with mental illness, I would be all too prepared to believe that I was crazy. So I just can't do it. And anybody else? Go ahead.
I'll say something here. So nobody brought up Holocaust. So I know it doesn't count because it's self-fulfilling, but I'm going to bring up Holocaust.
We didn't even get close.
So I'm going to do it myself. So Corey made reference to the actual, debate that I was listening to. I mentioned Frank Turek. The other person was Christopher Hitchens. And it was the same debate where he said he would tell God to F off if he asked him to sacrifice his son. And Frank Turek likes to bring up the Holocaust. It's an appeal to emotion kind of, and I get why it's compelling if you're not really thinking too deeply about it. He says, like, if you're an atheist, then you can't say the Holocaust was wrong. It's only wrong if there's an objective standard of wrongness, and that we only can get from God. So to be an atheist and say the Holocaust is wrong is to say that God exists. So atheists are borrowing from Christianity to even say that the Holocaust is wrong. And I would agree the Holocaust, I would disagree with him, obviously, with Turek's assessment. I would say that it's wrong, but it's not wrong because God said it's wrong. It's wrong because it hurt people. And that's how I personally am defining morality. Like, if you do something that hurts somebody, that's the grounding for me. It's not murder isn't wrong because God says it's wrong. It's wrong because it hurts people. And so it can't be grounded in God. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
So that's the question of what is good. Is it subjective or objective? That question sounds objective, but then the question
with respect to the subjective goal. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That's what I was saying earlier. morality can only be objective with respect to a subjective goal. And that's Sam Harris's his fatal flaw in his argument. And he's too smart that I almost think he knows this, and he's just invested too much work and published too many books that he doesn't want to admit it, that he's wrong. But there's an unstated assumption underneath all of his argument is basically, he uses the chess analogy. So I'll borrow from his chess analogy. He talks about like the rules of chess and says, you can use the scientific method to determine better and worse moves objectively in chess, just like you can use science to determine objectively which behaviors lead to better and worse outcomes if we're defining better and worse as harm and well-being. So you could say objectively, a world where we do X thing, where we go around murdering people, for example, objectively leads to more harm. And I grant all that. The unstated assumption is that we ought to avoid harm. If you don't grant that assumption, which fortunately pretty much everybody agrees we ought to prefer well-being to harm. But if you don't, then it wouldn't be true if you prefer harm to well-being, then you ought to go around murdering people.
In order to give some credit, though, to Sam Harris, to the atheists who say that you can create a moral paradigm that's objective outside of religion, and it's, as you've defined, this harming other conscious beings or creating harm is wrong. I think that it's still kind of safe to say, to me anyway, it seems safe to say that Sam Harris and those who would support that position are creating an objective stance on morality, saying what is good, what is evil. Mm-hmm. And yet we're just always going to be left with this question. This is where the cosmic skeptic comes in of, okay, now that we know what is good, what is evil, ought we to do what is good? And that seems to be the lesser of the questions, I suppose. This is why I think Dave was so hung up on that first question. I can't ever really know if this is the point, because I think that we do all agree. I think that in it can be assumed, as the cosmic skeptic says, because universally, once we can establish truly what good is, I suppose we would then say, sure, we ought to do it. Except in these weird hypotheticals that we've tried to force, where good seems so wretched to us.
Yeah. So universally, we agree that we all prefer well-being to harm. I mean, almost definitionally, that's what it means. If you preferred harm, then harm would be well-being, if that makes sense. Like, we prefer well-being to harm. It just is what it is. And so, and cosmic skeptic's point is, once you establish that, then you can treat everything else as though it's objective. So, and this is where I agree with Sam Harris, right? Sam Harris saying we can use the scientific method to determine objectively good and bad behavior based on that standard. Yeah. His flaw is not recognizing that standard is, philosophically speaking, subjective, but it might as well be objective because everybody agrees.
And then, as the cosmic skeptic says, and it's not a big deal that it's subjective, because any standard of morality is because I think maybe part of the problem is that in the cosmic skeptic's videos, he's kind of semantically defined morality such that it ends up being that it has to be subjective. And so
yeah, and when the Frank Turek, last thing, this will be my last comment. When the Frank Tureks of the world accuse atheists of saying, well, you can't say the Holocaust was objectively wrong, that's where I bring in cosmic skeptic. It's not a problem that we can't say it's objectively wrong. I'm content to say it's universally considered wrong, and that's enough to build a moral framework off of. It doesn't have to be a law of the universe that the Holocaust is wrong. I'm content to just say it's wrong because it hurts people. That's enough for me. That's my final word on morality.
Thank you. So now we've been running almost 75 minutes, haven't heard enough from Joey, so I want to give him kind of our final word, and then I'll take the final word. I've got one little thing to say. Go for it, Joey.
I would just say, like, I appreciate the intellectual honesty, Daniel, that it's enough for you to believe that it doesn't have to be universally objectively wrong for you to feel like it's wrong. I do want to push a little bit on what you said, though, right before you said that it might as well be universal because everyone agrees on it. And it may be true that a lot of people in Western society agree that harm is wrong, but the Holocaust happened because lots of people didn't believe harm was wrong, as long as the harm was being perpetrated on an inferior race. Mm-hmm. And lots of people still believe that. So it's just not the case that it may as well be universally believed, because it's not universally believed. So I don't want to take away what you just said, though, that it's enough for you to, believe that it's wrong, and it doesn't have to be an objective moral standard for you to be okay with, what's going on. I've been wanting to say for a long time now, you guys have been all chatting amongst yourselves, going all the way back to what Corey said, the Euthyphro's dilemma. This is obvious. I've even said this in a couple of previous videos. When it comes to that question of whether is something right because God said it's right, or did God say it's right because it's right? No surprises. I will come down on the side of if God says it, then it's right. But I would want to qualify that in pointing out that the classical view of God is that he's immutable. He doesn't change. He doesn't change his mind. So he's not just going to decide today murder is wrong, but tomorrow I'm going to change my mind and murder is not going to be wrong. I don't believe that happens with God. He's not capricious. He's not.
Didn't he though? Don't we have instances where murder was okay?
No. There are instances where capital punishment is commanded, but that's different from murder. Joshua's conquest, I can't quote like chapter and verse, but I'm pretty sure there are places where it says that the people who were killed deserved it, that they were a wicked nation, and that the people of Israel coming into the land of Canaan were coming in to
yeah, no, as long as God tells me,
I would be happy to have a conversation about whether or not the Bible's justified in saying that, but that's what the text says. The text does not say that God commanded the people of Israel to just go in and murder a bunch of innocents. That's not what the text says. That's a perfectly valid. I don't want to like hand wave it all away, because it's perfectly valid to dive further into that and figure out, right? But the text doesn't say that they went in and just murdered a bunch of innocents. It says that God commanded them to do it.
It doesn't use the word innocence.
Judgment.
It doesn't use the word innocence. It does use the word infants or babies. I mean, look, right. I don't want to get sidetracked on this, but this actually is a great example of getting to the point of what we were trying to say earlier, which is it just moves Stephen's hypothetical to the back end, which is, okay, now that this has happened, do you accept God's statement that it was righteous?
Right? And for better or worse, I do.
Right.
Here's the last point I want to make. All of this is fun to talk about and debate, but where we stand on this question of objective morality is like 3 or 4 steps down from some, and it's not like a broken record, because everything we talk about, I bring it back to this, but this all comes, it's like 3 or 4, different hops down from our real continental divides, right? If I accepted Daniel's epistemology of, look, I can only believe things that are proven to me through my senses, or I need satisfactory reason for belief, then I think I would 100% fall down on the line of, well, I don't think there can be any objective morality, and we just do the best we can. If I was LDS like Steve or like Dave, then it would come down to like, okay, fine, God's telling me this, but I'm going to wait until I have personal revelation on the matter before I decide, right? And my worldview, and the other thing I wanted to comment on, Daniel was saying that this is an argument for the existence of God, and I don't think I would ever argue in that direction. I would never argue, well, on the basis of the fact that objective morality does exist, then God must exist. I would go the other direction. I would start from, I believe God exists and is the ground of all that exists. Therefore, I think there is objective morality, and it comes from God. But I would get to does God exist, by a totally different route. I wouldn't go the direction that apparently Turek, and I know there's like I don't know, probably Plantinga and
William Lane Craig likes
what's his
that
name?
one too.
William Lane Craig. That's who I was trying to think of. Yeah, William Lane Craig. I just wouldn't. That doesn't. I don't know. I don't like that argument for the existence of God personally. Anyway,
I said I was done, but can I real briefly respond to Joey just because he addressed me, or address
Yeah,
something I
please.
said? Well, he addressed me in a couple things about the Holocaust example. You know, I grant that there were people who justified their actions. You know, there were Nazis who justified what they did. I want to be careful to not sound like I'm advocating for what would be the word? This idea that each culture gets to decide what's moral for themselves.
like
What's
situational, well, not even situational ethics. Yeah, like cultural. Like it's okay for a different culture to have a different set of ethics.
Moral
That-
relativism.
moral relative? Yeah, moral relativism.
Moral
is the words I was
relativism.
trying. I'm not saying that. So I'm not saying the Holocaust is right, is okay if you think it is. I'm saying on the subjective, the ultimately subjective standard of harm, any Nazis or anybody, Nazis or not, whether you're Nazi or not, anybody who tries to say the Holocaust wasn't wrong, I think I have the grounding as an atheist to still say you're objectively wrong with respect to the subjective goal of promoting the well-being of conscious creatures. The Jews are conscious creatures. They were harmed, so the Holocaust is wrong, objectively.
I think they jumped in with utilitarianism though, and they're like, well, in our view, for the greatest good of all of the intelligent creatures, it would be better if these ones didn't exist. Then we could all flourish better.
Yeah,
Which
and I
is-
still think they're wrong. Like making that
Well,
argument, like I think we would all agree that they're wrong.
Oh, yes,
They're
I'm just saying
clear.
that-
They're clearly
that's-
wrong.
So-
But I don't think it's because the analysis is you've harmed what'd you say? You've harmed a
I said
conscious creature,
creatures, but
and
yeah.
so therefore that's wrong. There are. I am
kill
prepared to
spiders and-
defend the proposition that there are situations in which it is not wrong to harm a conscious creature. I think
Well,
you probably would.
Yeah,
agree
I mean,
with
there's
that.
like the trolley. There's like the trolley problem where do you like switch the train onto the tracks to kill one person to save five? Absolutely.
Sure, and I suppose
No.
everything can be
So it's-
reduced.
So
to a
I'm talking
trolley
about
problem.
net. I'm
But
talking about
the other
net.
situation is capital punishment, which I brought up earlier. Like is
It's not. It doesn't even need to be capital punishment. Maybe you know any punishment harms a conscious creature.
right.
Yeah. So and again, it gets more complicated. We could have many more discussions about it. It's about the net good. So like you could definitely come up with scenarios where you have to harm somebody to do like cutting somebody open to do surgery that harms them, but in the long run it's for their ultimate well-being. And you can even think of like the trolley problem where
Sure.
not only do you harm somebody but you kill somebody, but the net is that you save 4 lives
But
because
that's
you
the problem.
save 5 by killing 1. So
The problem is
you
that we
could have
don't ever
those.
have. That's why I brought at the very beginning. Is like, but we don't have that ability to assess what
Yeah,
all
that's-
things considered the best thing to do is. So all we're doing is making a guess. But like I said, it's hard because like the Nazis were pretty deluded, and I'm pretty sure at least the worst of them were pretty convinced that this was the overall best thing for the planet. Which we say, well, that's bad, obviously, but they arrived at that conclusion from that same reasoning.
Yeah, epistemology is a whole other question, right? That comes into it, like knowing what is the best course of action in any given situation is a separate question, you know, that we could discuss another time. I mean, they're like, I don't know, that's a whole other issue. It would take too much time to
just
go
to
into.
Dave's point,
Fair.
Daniel, you've agreed previously that there are reasons why we should lock people up, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And that harms that person, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that they would prefer to not be locked up. Yeah, I mean, there might be people who prefer prison.
So now, so then, yeah, we've got just even that as it doesn't have to be the capital punishment or whatever. It's simply that we do think it is right to harm other conscious beings, locking them up, I guess, to protect others, right? That's that's a
Yeah,
trolley
there's a
problem.
greater
There's a
greater
value
good that's
judgment
being
there, yeah.
served. Yeah. It's just a weighing of consequences, you know.
And then of course there's not, I mean, further back in history you have the examples of ancient, wars like at the time of Troy, the Trojan War, and Odysseus and all of those, and how good at the time and morality was judged on how virtuous you were in battle, how powerful, and how, and good was might made right, and I think over the course of centuries, and in no small part arguably due to Christianity, though yes, Christianity has seen its share of these kinds of atrocities and genocides, absolutely, and yet the influence of this doctrine of charity and love has, I think, changed humanity's outlook on morality over the centuries, where it used to be might made right, and virtue in war was good, and so we ought then to go to war as often as possible and win these battles, and win things. Now it is, generally speaking, for most of societies, a feeling of love, with the possible exception of there are some radical religious groups that believe they ought to go to war and kill other people, and get rid of it. So again, we definitely have this first question of what is good, and I think that it does appear to be somewhat subjective, even when we posit a God. That's possible. I muted myself again. Forgive me. But I want to end by reading a statement from C.S. Lewis, and I found this on a blog called Curlew River, and I don't know for certain whether it's been quoted properly, but I'm going to assume it has, from Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis says, some people say that though decent conduct does not mean what pays each particular person at a particular moment, still it means what pays the human race as a whole, and that consequently there's no mystery about it. That's it. Whatever blesses the whole race is good, right? I'm paraphrasing. Human beings, after all, he says, to quote, have some sense. They see that you cannot have any real safety or happiness except in a society where everyone plays fair. And it is because they can see this that they try to behave decently. And if we ask, why ought I to be unselfish? And you reply, because it is good for society. We may then ask, why should I care what is good for society, except when it happens to pay me personally? And then you will have to say, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. And so C.S. Lewis ends, if a man asks, what is the point of behaving decently? It's no good replying, well, in order to benefit society, for trying to benefit society, in other words, being unselfish, because society, after all, only means other people. And that, let's see, for trying to benefit society, in other words, being unselfish, is one of the things that decent behavior consists in. And all you're really saying is that decent behavior is decent behavior. You ought to do what's good because it's good. And your words, and you would have said just as much if you had stopped at, men ought to be unselfish. And so C.S. Lewis ends, this is the final part in this quote here. He says, and that's where I do stop. Men ought to be unselfish, ought to be fair. Not that men are unselfish, not that they like being unselfish, but that they ought to be. I think, to me, it seems he recognizes this tautology, this undefined subjectiveness of what we've been saying of why ought we to do what's good. The second question, and the only answer is because we ought. we ought to do what's good, and I think we kind of agree on that. And that's where I think we'll leave it for today. Thanks so much for joining us.
I would place bets that Lewis ends up with my view, though. I'm sure he develops that argument into the reason why we feel that way is because there's a real God who is the ground of all things, and that's why morality is objective.
He does. He does. His argument overall is to prove there's a God, and yet it's still quite subjective as to why we ought to obey that God or ought to do what's right. So we know that it, and that's just it. That's the evidence that he uses. Then is simply this: we feel this, we know that we ought to do good, and that doesn't get us though any step further down. The why. It doesn't answer the why. So, and that was his point too. We got to stop right there. There is no answer to why ought we to do what's good. We just know we should. So anyway,
I have a really quick quote if you can. 2 seconds.
I've cut it off 3 or 4 times. I guess no one's
Right.
watching this anyway. No, actually, we do have about 3 people watching right now. But anyway, go ahead, Corey.
All right, it's real quick. It's just stating, I'll just read it. So it says, this is from an LDS perspective, I guess. The most basic moral law is that each person ought to act so that each shall have the best life possible within the constraints posed by eternal conditions necessary for mutual self-realization. The eternal conditions are those based upon the nature of intelligences to fully realize their potential to be as God is. And that is done by reflecting the type of love that the Father has for the Son in our relationships. And it just so happens that whatever leads to human flourishing and self-realization is also what leads us to heal relationships and refrain from injuring them and other people. That was something from my dad. I just thought was an interesting conclusion from an LDS perspective.